Damascus, Syria, March 1967. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient streets as Khalil Mansour stepped out of his apartment building on Masalan Street, adjusting his tie with the practiced precision of a man who understood that every detail mattered. The 38-year-old Syrian diplomat had spent the last 12 years building an impeccable reputation within the foreign ministry, earning the trust of ministers and generals alike. He believed his careful discretion, his loyalty to the Ba'ath Party, and his unwavering dedication to Syrian interests had made him untouchable. He had no way of knowing that 4,000 kilometers away in Tel Aviv, a team of intelligence officers had already decided that his very trustworthiness would become the instrument of his downfall. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. The story of how Mossad, Israel's legendary intelligence agency, orchestrated one of the most elaborate psychological operations of the Cold War era begins not with violence or intrigue, but with something far more powerful and dangerous: the human heart. In an age when superpowers played chess with nations, when the Middle East simmered with tensions that could ignite World War III at any moment, Israeli intelligence discovered that the most sophisticated weapon wasn't a spy satellite or a hidden microphone. It was a carefully crafted love letter, written in elegant French script on expensive paper, carrying the perfume of jasmine and the promise of a life that Khalil Mansour had only allowed himself to dream about in his loneliest moments. The operation that would come to be known internally as Operation Nightingale began 6 months earlier, in the autumn of 1966, in a nondescript office building in northern Tel Aviv. Major David Kimchi sat across from his commanding officer, studying a thin file that contained everything Mossad had managed to gather on Syrian diplomatic personnel stationed abroad. The six-day war was still months away, but tensions between Israel and its neighbors had reached a fever pitch. Syrian artillery regularly shelled Israeli settlements from the Golan Heights. Skirmishes along the border claimed lives weekly. Both nations were locked in an intelligence war that neither could afford to lose. Kimche, a scholarly man with wire-rimmed glasses and a doctorate in Middle Eastern history from Oxford, didn't look like a spy. That was precisely what made him one of Mossad's most valuable officers. He had a gift for understanding human psychology, for identifying the invisible cracks in a person's armor. As he reviewed the files that morning, his eyes kept returning to one particular dossier: Khalil Mansour, Syrian diplomat, currently serving as a mid-level attaché at the Syrian embassy in Brussels, Belgium, unmarried, no close family ties. A man who had dedicated his life to his country at the expense of everything else. Then Kimche said, his finger tapping the photograph of Mansour, "This is our opening. The man is lonely. Look at his pattern. He eats alone. He works late every night. He hasn't taken a vacation in 3 years. He's competent, trusted, but isolated. Isolation makes people vulnerable." His commanding officer, Colonel Meir Amit, leaned back in his chair, skeptical. "You want to run a romance operation? Those take months to develop, David. We need intelligence now. Syrian troop movements, Soviet weapons shipments. We can't wait for some diplomat to fall in love." Kimche smiled thinly. "Who said anything about waiting? We don't need him to fall in love with a real person. We need him to fall in love with the idea of escape, with the possibility of a life beyond the one he's trapped in. Give me 3 months. If I'm wrong, we move on to the next target." Amit studied the younger officer for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 3 months. But David, if this goes wrong, if he reports the contact to Syrian intelligence, we won't just lose an operation. We'll expose our methods. Every diplomat in every Syrian embassy will be on alert. Then we make sure it doesn't go wrong, Kimchi replied, already mentally drafting the first letter. The woman they created existed only on paper, but she was more real than most flesh and blood people. Her name was Juliette Moreau, a French art historian working at the Musée Royal des Beaux-Arts in Brussels. 34 years old. Recently divorced from a Belgian banker who had failed to understand her passion for Renaissance painting and medieval manuscripts. She lived alone in a modest apartment in the Ixelles district, spent her evenings reading poetry, and possessed a rare combination of intellectual sophistication and emotional vulnerability that Kim Chae calculated would appeal to a man like Mansour. Mossad's forgers created an entire life for Juliet. They produced a French passport with genuine stamps from travels across Europe. They established a work history at the museum, complete with published academic papers on Flemish painting that bore her name. They even placed her photograph, taken of an actual Mossad agent who resembled the description they'd crafted, in the museum's staff directory. If Mansour decided to verify her existence, every detail would check out perfectly. The only problem was that Juliette Moreau had never met Khalil Mansour, would never meet him, and in fact didn't actually exist beyond the elaborate fiction Mossad had constructed. The first letter arrived at the Syrian embassy in Brussels on a Tuesday morning in November 1966. It was hand-delivered by a local courier service, addressed to Khalil Mansour personally, written in flawless French on cream-colored stationery that carried the faint scent of jasmine perfume. The envelope bore no return address, only the initials JM embossed in subtle gold leaf in the upper left corner. Mansour opened it during his lunch break, expecting perhaps an invitation to some diplomatic function or academic lecture. Instead, he found himself reading something entirely unexpected. The letter began with an apology for the unusual method of contact, explaining that the writer had attended a cultural symposium at the embassy 3 weeks earlier, a lecture on Syrian poetry and literature that Mansour had helped organize as part of his cultural attaché duties. The writer, who identified herself only as Juliet, explained that she had been deeply moved by his brief remarks about the importance of preserving cultural heritage in an age of political turmoil. The letter continued, "I hope you'll forgive my boldness in writing to you this way. I am not usually so forward, but your words that evening resonated with something I've been feeling for a long time. A sense that in our modern world, we've lost touch with the deeper meaning of art and beauty. As someone who spends my days studying paintings created centuries ago, I often feel like a guardian of forgotten treasures, understood by few and appreciated by even fewer. From your speech, I sensed that you might understand this feeling. It was perfectly calibrated. The letter expressed interest without being aggressive, intelligence without condescension, vulnerability without seeming desperate. Most importantly, it appealed to Mansour's sense of himself as a man of culture and refinement, someone whose contributions went beyond mere diplomatic paperwork. Kim Chae had studied every speech Mansour had given, every article he'd written for Syrian cultural journals, and had identified the man's deepest need, to be seen as more than just another functionary in the machinery of state. Mansour read the letter 3 times that afternoon. His first instinct was to dismiss it as some kind of prank or worse, a clumsy intelligence operation. But the tone was wrong for that, too subtle, too genuinely intellectual. That evening, instead of working late as usual, he found himself walking past the Musée Royal des Beaux-Arts on his way home. The museum was closed, its windows dark, but he stood across the street for several minutes, wondering if somewhere inside, a woman named Juliet was cataloguing paintings and thinking, perhaps, about the lonely diplomat who had spoken about Syrian poetry. He didn't respond immediately. Caution was second nature to a man in his position. Instead, he spent the next week making discreet inquiries. He mentioned to a colleague at the French embassy that he'd recently attended a fascinating lecture at the Musée Royal. Had they heard of any researchers there named Juliet? The colleague checked and confirmed yes, there was a Juliette Moreau in the Renaissance art department. Quite respected, actually, had published several papers on Flemish primitives. Mansour felt something relax in his chest. She was real. 2 weeks after receiving the first letter, he composed a response. He kept it formal but warm, thanking Juliet for her kind words, and agreeing that in their respective fields they both served as bridges between past and present. He suggested that if she was interested, he could arrange for her to have access to some Syrian manuscripts held in the embassy's cultural collection, pieces that rarely saw public display but might interest someone with her academic background. He signed it simply Khalil Mansour and included his direct office telephone number. In Tel Aviv, when Kim Chae received the coded message that Mansour had responded, He allowed himself a small smile. The hook was set. Now came the delicate work of reeling him in without letting him realize he was being caught. The correspondence between Khalil Mansour and the fictional Juliette Moreau developed slowly over the winter of 1966 and into the spring of 1967. Each letter from Juliette was crafted by Kimche and a small team of psychological operations specialists, then handwritten by a female Mossad agent whose handwriting and French prose style had been carefully developed to remain consistent. They wrote about art and literature, about the loneliness of dedication to work that few others understood, about the small moments of beauty that made life bearable in uncertain times. Juliette never pushed for personal meetings. This was crucial to the operation's success. Had she seemed too eager, Mansour's natural caution would have been triggered. Instead, she remained tantalizingly just out of reach. She mentioned being away for research trips when he suggested meeting for coffee. She apologized for her busy schedule, her obligations to the museum. But her letters grew gradually more personal, more intimate in their emotional revelations. In one letter, she wrote about her failed marriage, about how her ex-husband had viewed her work as a hobby rather than a calling. I think he wanted a wife who would be content organizing dinner parties and discussing the price of real estate, she wrote. He never understood that when I stand before a painting by Jan van Eyck or Rogier van der Weyden, I'm not just looking at colors on wood. I'm touching hands across 5 centuries with another human being who understood beauty and transcendence. I suppose that makes me strange, perhaps even selfish, but I cannot be other than what I am. Mansour found himself thinking about those words for days afterward. They echoed his own feelings of isolation, his sense that he had sacrificed personal happiness for professional dedication. He began to write more openly in his own letters, sharing frustrations he had never voiced to anyone. He wrote about the weight of representing a nation in turmoil, about the exhaustion of maintaining appearances, about his fear that he was living a life that would be remembered by no one and had touched no hearts. What Mansour didn't know was that every word he wrote was being analyzed by Mossad psychologists. They tracked his emotional state, his growing attachment, the subtle ways his language became more vulnerable with each exchange. Kimche recognized the signs of a man beginning to imagine a different life, a life where he wasn't alone, where someone understood him. That imagination was the crack they needed. In March 1967, Juliette's letters took on a new tone. She wrote about feeling increasingly disillusioned with her life in Brussels, about wondering whether the quiet desperation of academic work was truly fulfilling. She mentioned casually that she had been offered a research position at a museum in Geneva, Switzerland. It would mean leaving Belgium, starting fresh somewhere new. She was uncertain whether to accept. The choice of Geneva was deliberate. Switzerland's neutrality made it a city where Syrian diplomats could travel without excessive scrutiny. More importantly, it was a city where Mossad could operate with relative freedom, where the tight surveillance of a place like Damascus or even Brussels would be absent. If they could get Mansour to Geneva, they could control the environment completely. Mansour's response revealed exactly what Kimche had hoped for. The diplomat encouraged Juliette to take the position, suggested it might be good for her to have a fresh start. Then, as if the thought had just occurred to him, he mentioned that he occasionally had reason to travel to Geneva for diplomatic meetings. Perhaps, he wrote, if she did accept the position and if circumstances aligned, they might finally meet in person. It would be pleasant, he continued, to share a coffee with someone who understands the loneliness of dedication. Juliette's reply came 10 days later. She had accepted the Geneva position. She would be moving in May. And yes, she wrote, she would very much like to meet him if he found himself in Geneva. I feel, she wrote in words Kimche had spent hours perfecting, that I already know you through these letters. But there is something about conversation, about seeing a person's expressions and hearing their voice, that letters cannot capture. I find myself hoping very much that circumstances will indeed align. What Mansour read as hopeful anticipation was actually a carefully constructed trap closing around him. Mossad now had him emotionally invested in meeting a woman who didn't exist, in a city where they controlled every variable. The next phase of the operation would require perfect timing and flawless execution. They would get one chance. If Mansour suspected anything, if even a single detail seemed wrong, he would disappear back into the safety of diplomatic protocol, and they would never get another opportunity. Colonel Amit approved the Geneva phase of Operation Nightingale with significant reservations. "We're moving into active territory now," he told Kimche in a meeting in late April. "Once we bring him to Geneva, once we make contact in person, we can't just let him walk away with questions. This has to end with either a recruitment or a clean extraction. There's no middle ground." Kimche nodded, understanding perfectly what his commander meant. Either Khalil Mansour would be turned into a Mossad asset, feeding Israel intelligence about Syrian operations, or he would have to be taken out of play entirely, removed from his position in a way that didn't expose the operation. The letter campaign had been elegant and low risk. What came next would be considerably more dangerous. The woman they chose to play Juliette Moreau in person was a Mossad agent named Rachel Shamir, though she would never use that name in Geneva. At 32, she was a veteran of several operations, fluent in 6 languages, with a doctorate in art history that was entirely genuine. She had grown up in Paris before immigrating to Israel, which gave her the perfect accent and cultural references. More importantly, she had the ability to inhabit a role completely, to become the person she was pretending to be so thoroughly that even trained intelligence officers had difficulty spotting the deception. Rachel spent 3 weeks preparing for the meeting. She memorized every letter that had been sent to Mansour, absorbing Juliette's voice, her turns of phrase, her intellectual interests. She studied Renaissance art until she could speak about it with genuine expertise. She even underwent a subtle physical transformation, styling her hair and selecting clothing that matched the artistic, slightly bohemian persona they had created. When Kimchi watched her practice during a rehearsal, he found himself half believing she actually was Juliette Moreau. The invitation to Geneva came in mid-May, delivered through official diplomatic channels. The Syrian Foreign Ministry informed Mansour that he would be part of a delegation attending a United Nations conference on cultural heritage preservation. The conference would run for 4 days in late May. He was to represent Syrian interests on a panel discussing the protection of archaeological sites during regional conflicts. It was exactly the kind of assignment that fit his background and expertise. What he didn't know was that Mossad had been quietly lobbying through intermediaries to ensure Syria sent representatives to this particular conference, and that Mansour's name appeared on the delegation list. 2 days before his departure for Geneva, Mansour received a final letter from Juliette. She expressed delight that he would be in the city, suggested a small cafe near the museum where she now worked, proposed they meet for coffee on the 2nd afternoon of his stay. The time and place were specific, and she signed the letter with a warmth that made Mansour's heart beat faster. "I have been looking forward to this meeting more than I perhaps should admit," she wrote. Until then, Jay. The café Juliette had suggested, Le Café des Philosophes, sat on a quiet street in Geneva's old town, far enough from the conference center to feel private, but not so isolated as to seem suspicious. Mossad had selected it carefully. They controlled the café's owner, who was actually a Mossad asset. They had surveillance positions in the apartments above and across the street. They had backup teams stationed at every exit from the old town, and they had Rachel, sitting at a corner table, dressed in a navy blue dress with a silk scarf, a book about Flemish painting open before her, looking for all the world like an art historian waiting nervously for a first date. Khalil Mansour arrived exactly on time, which Rachel had expected from a man of his precise nature. She watched him enter the café, scanning the room with the automatic caution of someone trained to notice threats. Their eyes met, and she smiled, a gesture calibrated to convey recognition, pleasure, and just a hint of shy uncertainty. He walked to her table and she stood, extending her hand. "Monsieur Mansour," she said in flawless Parisian French, "I would recognize you anywhere from your photograph in the embassy materials. How wonderful to finally meet you in person." They shook hands, and she felt the slight tremor in his grip, the nervousness of a man stepping into unfamiliar territory. "Please, call me Khalil," he said, and she noted the way his eyes took in her face, searching for confirmation that she was real, that this moment he had anticipated for months was actually happening. "Then you must call me Juliet," she replied, gesturing for him to sit. I've already ordered tea. I hope you don't mind. I was early, I'm afraid. I've been looking forward to this conversation. They talked for 2 hours that afternoon, and Rachel delivered a performance that would have impressed theatre critics. She was warm but not effusive, intelligent but not intimidating, interested without seeming intrusive. She asked about his work, listened with genuine-seeming fascination as he discussed Syrian cultural policy, shared stories about her own research that demonstrated real expertise. Every few minutes their conversation would circle back to the themes that had run through their letters: loneliness, dedication, the sense of being understood by too few people in the world. At one point, Mansour looked at her with an expression of such unguarded hope that Rachel felt an unexpected twinge of something that might have been guilt. This is a good man, she thought, a lonely man who has done nothing wrong except serve his country faithfully, and we are about to destroy his life. But she pushed the thought aside. This was the work. Khalil Mansour had access to information that could save Israeli lives. In the calculus of intelligence operations, one man's happiness weighed nothing against national security. She smiled at him and suggested they walk together through the old town, extending the afternoon into early evening. As they walked along the narrow streets, past shops selling watches and chocolates, Rachel carefully steered the conversation toward the future. She spoke about how meaningful it was to finally meet him, how rare it was to find someone who understood the particular loneliness of their kinds of work. She mentioned carefully that she found herself thinking about what might develop between them, whether this could be the beginning of something rather than just a pleasant afternoon. Mansour stopped walking, turning to face her on a small bridge over the Rhône. The river flowed beneath them, dark and swift. "Juliet," he said, and she heard the emotion in his voice. "I must be honest with you. These past months, your letters have meant more to me than I can adequately express. I have thought about you constantly. But I must also be realistic. My life is in Brussels, my work is there. You are here now. I cannot simply walk away from my responsibilities." This was the moment Kimche had prepared her for, the pivot point where Mansour would voice the practical obstacles to their relationship. It was Rachel's job to transform those obstacles into opportunities. She reached out and gently touched his arm, a gesture that was both intimate and tentative. "I understand," she said softly. "Your dedication is one of the things I admire most about you. But Khalil, may I ask you something? When was the last time you did something simply because it made you happy? Not because it was your duty, not because it advanced your career, but because it fed your soul." He had no answer for that. She could see him struggling with the question, with the realization that he couldn't remember the last time he had made a choice based purely on personal desire. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am not suggesting anything reckless. I am simply saying that perhaps we deserve to explore what this connection might become. You could visit Geneva more often. I could travel to Brussels. We could see whether what we've found in letters translates into something real. Life is short, Khalil, and it is very lonely when lived alone." He looked at her for a long moment, and Rachel saw the war happening behind his eyes, duty battling against desire, caution fighting hope. Then he smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "You are right," he said. "You are absolutely right. Yes, let us explore this. Let us see what becomes of two lonely people who found each other through letters about art and poetry." They made plans to meet again the next evening, after Mansour's conference obligations were complete. Rachel suggested a restaurant she knew, supposedly a favorite of hers, where they could have dinner and talk more privately. The restaurant, naturally, was another Mossad-controlled location, though Mansour had no way of knowing that. When they parted that evening, with a brief embrace that was both promise and farewell, Mansour walked back to his hotel feeling lighter than he had in years. Rachel watched him go, then turned and walked in the opposite direction, toward a safe house where Kimche was waiting with the rest of the operation team. "How was he?" Kimche asked as soon as she entered. Rachel pulled off the scarf she'd been wearing and ran her fingers through her hair. "Completely hooked," she reported. "He's imagining a future with her, with me, with Juliet. He's vulnerable now in a way he wasn't before. If we're going to make the pitch, tomorrow night is the time." Kimche nodded slowly. The pitch was the most dangerous part of the entire operation. Tomorrow evening, during dinner, they would reveal to Khalil Mansour that Juliette Moreau was not who he thought she was, that he had been the target of an elaborate intelligence operation, and that he now had a choice to make. He could work with Mossad, providing information about Syrian diplomatic activities and military plans, or he could return to Damascus, knowing that evidence of his correspondence with an Israeli agent would eventually make its way to Syrian intelligence. It was blackmail, wrapped in the language of opportunity, and it had to be delivered with perfect precision. If he refuses the pitch, if he decides to report us immediately, one of the team members asked, "What's the contingency?" Kimchi's expression was grim. "Then we extract him involuntarily and he disappears. Israel takes the diplomatic hit for kidnapping a Syrian diplomat, but we make sure he never tells Damascus what happened. Those are the orders from the top." Rachel felt her stomach tighten. She had been in dangerous operations before, but there was something particularly cold-blooded about this one. They had manipulated a man's deepest emotions, exploited his loneliness, and now they were going to break his heart and give him an ultimatum that might end with his death or disappearance. This was the ugly reality of intelligence work that no one talked about in polite company. The next evening, Khalil Mansour arrived at the restaurant 10 minutes early, which Rachel had expected. He wore his best suit and carried a small bouquet of flowers, which he presented to her with a shy smile that made her feel like the worst person in the world. They were seated at a corner table, private but not isolated, with a clear view of the street outside. 3 Mossad agents were positioned around the restaurant, disguised as waitstaff and diners. A van waited 2 blocks away, ready for emergency extraction if necessary. The dinner began pleasantly enough. They ordered wine and talked about the conference, about Rachel's supposed work at the museum, about their plans to see each other again. Mansour was more relaxed than he had been the previous day, his guard lowered by 24 hours, of imagining a future that included regular visits to Geneva, weekend trips together, perhaps eventually something more permanent. He talked about possibly requesting a transfer to a Swiss posting, about how his career might accommodate a personal relationship. Rachel let him talk, watching the clock, waiting for Kimchi's signal. It came exactly on schedule, a flash of light from across the street, visible only to her. Time to deliver the truth. "Khalil," she said, interrupting him mid-sentence, "there is something I need to tell you. Something important." The tone of her voice made him pause, his wine glass halfway to his lips. He set it down carefully, his diplomat's instincts suddenly alert. "What is it?" he asked. Rachel took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried none of the warmth it had held moments before. "My name is not Juliette Moreau. I do not work at the Musée Royal des Beaux-Arts. The woman you have been corresponding with for the past 6 months does not exist. I am an officer with Israeli intelligence, and you have been the subject of an operation designed to bring you to this exact moment." The color drained from Mansour's face. For a moment he looked as though he might be sick. He started to stand, but Rachel's next words stopped him. "Please sit down, Khalil. If you leave this restaurant now, you will be arrested before you reach your hotel. If you attempt to notify Syrian intelligence, evidence of your correspondence with an Israeli agent will be delivered to Damascus within hours. Your career will be over. Your reputation will be destroyed. You may face charges of treason. So please, sit down, and let me explain your options." Mansour sat slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. His voice, when he found it, was barely a whisper. "Why? Why would you do this?" "Because we need what you have access to," Rachel said simply. "Syrian military movements, diplomatic communications, intelligence about Soviet weapons shipments. You are positioned to provide us with information that could prevent a war, or at the very least save Israeli lives if war comes. We are offering you an opportunity to work with us." Mansour's laugh was bitter and broken. "An opportunity? You have manipulated me, humiliated me, exploited my loneliness, and now you call it an opportunity. I am a loyal Syrian. I would never betray my country." Then Kimchi's voice came from directly behind him, making Mansour jump. "No one is asking you to betray Syria," Kimchi said, pulling out a chair and sitting down without invitation. "We are asking you to prevent unnecessary deaths. Let me be very clear about your situation, Mr. Mansour. You have three choices. Kimche laid out the options with clinical precision. First, Mansour could agree to work with Mossad, providing carefully selected information that would be valuable to Israel, but would not fundamentally compromise Syrian security. He would continue his diplomatic career, would live his life in Brussels, but would occasionally pass intelligence through secure channels. In exchange, Israel would ensure his correspondence with Juliet never reached Damascus, and he would be financially compensated. Second, he could refuse and return to Damascus immediately. In that case, within 72 hours, Syrian intelligence would receive an anonymous package containing copies of all his letters, along with photographs of him meeting with Rachel in Geneva, and fabricated evidence suggesting he had already been passing information to Israel. His life, as he knew it, would end. Third, he could refuse to cooperate and attempt to warn his government immediately. In that scenario, Kimche said quietly, you would be detained by Israeli intelligence, extracted to Israel through channels I will not detail, and you would become a prisoner. That is the option no one in this room wants, but it is an option that exists. Mansour looked between them, his face a mask of anguish and rage. You are monsters, he said, both of you. This is evil. Rachel felt those words like physical blows, but she kept her expression neutral. This is intelligence work, she replied. It is neither good nor evil, it simply is. The question before you now is not moral judgment, Khalil. The question is survival. What choice will you make? For 3 long minutes, Mansour said nothing. Rachel could see him running through scenarios in his mind, looking for some fourth option that didn't exist. His entire world had collapsed in the space of a conversation. The woman he had imagined building a life with was an illusion. His private thoughts, shared in letters he believed were intimate and safe, were now weapons being used against him. And the choices before him all led to some form of betrayal, either of his country or of himself. Finally, he spoke, his voice hollow. What kind of information would you want? Diplomatic communications, Kimche said immediately. Advance notice of Syrian policy decisions, details about military hardware purchases, names of intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover. Nothing that would directly endanger Syrian troops in the field, but everything that would give Israel strategic advantage in understanding Syrian intentions. And if I provide this information, Mansour asked, how do I know you won't simply demand more and more until I have nothing left to give? How do I know this doesn't end with me exposed regardless? You don't, Kimche admitted. You have to trust that keeping you as a functioning asset is more valuable to us than burning you for short-term gain. Intelligence work requires trust, even between enemies. We need you to remain valuable, which means we need you to remain undiscovered. Mansour closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something fundamental had changed in his expression. The hope and vulnerability he had carried into the restaurant were gone, replaced by cold resignation. I will need time to think about this, he said. You have until tomorrow morning, Kimche replied. Meet Rachel, Juliet, at 9 o'clock at the same cafe where you first met. Give her your answer then. If you agree, we will set up secure communication protocols. If you refuse, well, you understand the consequences. They left Mansour sitting alone at the table, the dinner plate still full, the wine growing warm. Rachel didn't look back as they exited the restaurant, but she could feel his eyes on her back, filled with betrayal and hatred. Outside in the van that would take them to the safe house, she finally allowed herself to feel the weight of what they had done. That was the hardest pitch I've ever delivered, she told Kimche. He's completely broken. But will he cooperate? Kimche asked. That's all that matters now. Rachel nodded slowly. Yes, he'll cooperate. He has too much to lose by refusing. But David, we've destroyed that man. Even if he never gets caught, even if he lives to old age, we've taken something from him that he'll never get back. Kimche was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at Geneva's night streets. That's the cost of this work, he finally said. We carry that weight so that others don't have to. It's not pretty, it's not honorable, but it keeps people alive. The next morning, Khalil Mansour appeared at Le Café des Philosophes at exactly 9 o'clock. He looked as though he hadn't slept, dark circles under his eyes, his suit slightly rumpled. Rachel was already seated at the same table where they'd first met, a bitter symmetry that wasn't lost on either of them. He sat down without greeting her, without any of the warmth that had characterized their previous meetings. "I will do what you ask," he said simply, "not because I believe your justifications, not because I think this serves any higher purpose, but because I am a coward, and I value my life and my freedom more than my principles. I hope you're satisfied." Rachel slid a small package across the table. Inside were detailed instructions for secure communications, a contact protocol, and a modest initial payment in Swiss francs. "We don't need you to be a hero, Khalil," she said quietly. "We just need you to survive and provide us with what we've discussed. Follow the protocols exactly. Never deviate. Never try to be clever. If you do this properly, you can live a full life and retire with dignity." "And the letters?" Mansour asked. "The letters from Juliet. Were any of those words true? Did any of that woman actually exist?" Rachel considered lying, considered offering him some small comfort, but she respected him enough to tell the truth. "Every word was calculated to appeal to your emotional needs and create a bond we could exploit. Juliet Moreau never existed." "I'm sorry." Mansour nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already known. Then he stood, picked up the package and walked out of the cafe without another word. Rachel watched him go, this broken man who would now live a double life, forever looking over his shoulder, forever wondering if today would be the day his secret was discovered. Over the following 18 months, until the Six-Day War in June 1967 fundamentally changed the balance of power in the Middle East, Khalil Mansour provided Mossad with valuable intelligence about Syrian military preparations, diplomatic initiatives, and Soviet military aid. The information he supplied helped Israeli military planners understand Syrian capabilities and intentions, contributing to the devastating effectiveness of Israeli airstrikes in the war's opening hours. Syrian Air Force bases, carefully documented in reports Mansour had passed along, were destroyed before their aircraft could take off. Syrian armor movements, anticipated through diplomatic cables Mansour had photographed, were met with prepared Israeli defensive positions. Mansour never knew the full impact of the information he provided. Mossad was careful to mix his intelligence with data from other sources, ensuring that no single leak could be traced back to him. He continued his diplomatic career, was even promoted to a more senior position in the Syrian Foreign Ministry after the war, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on his Mossad handlers. On the outside, he appeared to be a successful diplomat, respected by his colleagues, trusted by his superiors. On the inside, he was a man who had been hollowed out, living a performance of loyalty while betraying everything he had once believed in. Rachel Shamir never met Khalil Mansour again after that morning in Geneva. She moved on to other operations, other identities, other targets who never knew they were being manipulated until it was too late. But she never forgot the look in Mansour's eyes when she told him Juliet didn't exist. Years later, after she had left active operations and was training the next generation of Mossad officers, she would use Operation Nightingale as a case study in psychological manipulation. But she would always end the lesson with a warning. "This work requires us to do terrible things to people who may not deserve it," she would tell her students. "Never forget that. Never let yourself become so comfortable with the manipulation that you stop seeing your targets as human beings. The moment you do, you've lost something essential about yourself." Khalil Mansour's ultimate fate remains classified in Mossad's files. Some reports suggest he continued to provide intelligence until his retirement from the Syrian Foreign Ministry in the early 1980s. Other accounts indicate he attempted to break contact with his handlers in the mid-1970s and had to be reactivated through renewed blackmail. One unconfirmed story claims he eventually confessed his betrayal to a trusted friend who reported him to Syrian intelligence, leading to his quiet execution. The truth, like so much in the world of espionage, remains hidden behind layers of secrecy and conflicting accounts. What is documented, however, is the operation itself, Operation Nightingale, which became a template for future psychological operations. The careful construction of a fictional relationship, the exploitation of loneliness and emotional need, the gradual building of trust, followed by the devastating revelation and ultimatum, All of these elements would be used again and again by intelligence agencies around the world. The operation proved that in the Cold War era, when nations possessed weapons capable of destroying civilization, sometimes the most effective tool wasn't a missile or a spy satellite. Sometimes it was simply a love letter, written by someone who understood the deepest vulnerabilities of the human heart. The broader lesson of Operation Nightingale extends beyond intelligence tradecraft. It speaks to the fundamental tension between individual happiness and national security, between personal morality and strategic necessity. Khalil Mansour was not a bad man. He had not committed crimes. He had simply been lonely, and that loneliness had made him vulnerable to people who were willing to exploit it for purposes he would have found abhorrent. In turning him, Mossad saved Israeli lives, but they also destroyed a man's ability to trust, to love, to believe that anything in his life was genuinely his own. David Kimche, who orchestrated the operation, would later become one of Mossad's most celebrated officers, eventually serving as the agency's deputy director. In his memoirs, published decades after his retirement, he wrote briefly about Operation Nightingale, though he changed names and details to protect sources and methods. He described it as a necessary operation that achieved its objectives efficiently. But in a rare moment of reflection, he added a single sentence that suggested the moral weight he carried. "We who work in shadows tell ourselves we serve the light, but sometimes I wonder if we can even remember what light looks like." For Rachel Shamir, now retired and living quietly in northern Israel, the memory of Khalil Mansour occasionally surfaces, usually in the quiet hours before dawn. She wonders if he ever found happiness, if he ever allowed himself to trust anyone after Geneva, if in his final moments, whenever they came, he thought about a woman named Juliet who had promised him understanding and delivered betrayal. She tells herself that the work was necessary. That intelligence operations saved countless lives. That individual suffering sometimes had to be weighed against collective security. But late at night, when she cannot sleep, she remembers the flowers he brought to their second meeting, and the way his face had looked when she told him Juliette Moreau never existed. Those memories don't fade no matter how many years pass. The Middle East conflict that formed the backdrop to Operation Nightingale continues to this day, its roots reaching back through decades of grievance, fear, and competing claims to land and legitimacy. The six-day war that Mansour's intelligence helped Israel prepare for created as many problems as it solved, redrawing borders and creating new grievances that would fuel violence for generations. In that larger context, one diplomat's manipulation seems almost trivial, a footnote to history. But for the individuals involved, for Khalil Mansour, who lost his ability to trust, for Rachel Shamir, who lost her belief in the moral simplicity of her work, the operation was anything but trivial. It was the defining experience of their lives, the moment when they learned that in the service of nations, individual human hearts become expendable. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Operation Nightingale is how easily it could be replicated. The loneliness that made Mansour vulnerable is universal. The desire for connection, for understanding, for someone who sees and values who you truly are, these are fundamental human needs. In exploiting those needs, Mossad demonstrated that no one is truly safe from manipulation, that the most sophisticated defenses can be bypassed by someone who understands what you long for and is willing to offer it, no matter how false the offering might be. In the decades since Operation Nightingale, intelligence agencies have become even more sophisticated in their psychological operations. Digital communications have made it easier to create elaborate fictional identities and maintain them across multiple platforms. Social media provides detailed information about targets' interests, relationships, and vulnerabilities. The fundamental technique pioneered in operations like Nightingale, identifying emotional needs and exploiting them through manufactured relationships, has been refined and industrialized. Yet for all the technological advancement, the human element remains central. Someone still has to craft the messages, maintain the fictional personality, deliver the final revelation and ultimatum. Someone still has to look into the eyes of the target and watch them realize their life has been a manipulation. That someone carries the weight of what they've done, whether they admit it or not. The story of how Mossad used a love letter to lure a Syrian diplomat into a trap is ultimately a story about the cost of security, measured not just in budget allocations and military hardware, but in human dignity and broken trust. It's a story about the calculations nations make in the name of survival, and about the individuals who bear the consequences of those calculations. Khalil Mansour's lonely apartment in Damascus, Rachel Shamir's sleepless nights in northern Israel, David Kimchi's moment of doubt in his memoir, these are the true casualties of Operation Nightingale, as real as any soldier killed in combat, as permanent as any border redrawn by war. In the end, intelligence work comes down to a simple, terrible equation. What are you willing to do to protect your people? What lines are you willing to cross? What part of your humanity are you willing to sacrifice? For the officers who planned and executed Operation Nightingale, the answer was clear. They were willing to exploit a lonely man's deepest emotional needs, to offer him hope and connection, and then to transform that hope into blackmail. They were willing to carry the weight of that manipulation for the rest of their lives. Whether that willingness represents courage or moral compromise, whether it serves a higher purpose or simply perpetuates cycles of deception and betrayal, remains an open question, one that each generation must answer for itself. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.